The map of North America was not shaped by a single war. It was not created by a single king. It was not built by gold rushes alone. Long before railroads crossed the continent, before wagon trails reached the Pacific, and before great cities rose along rivers and lakes, another force was quietly transforming the northern half of North America. That force was the fur trade. For nearly 3 centuries, millions of animal pelts moved through forests, across lakes, along rivers, and over mountain passes. They traveled from indigenous hunting grounds to remote trading posts, from trading posts to ocean-going ships, and from those ships to the crowded cities of Europe. The trade generated fortunes. It inspired exploration. It fueled alliances and wars. It created companies that governed territories larger than many nations. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, much of this vast system revolved around a single animal: the beaver. Tonight, as we slowly journey through the history of the fur trade that helped build North America, we will discover how a creature weighing little more than 40 or 50 pounds became one of the most important economic resources on an entire continent. But before we travel into the forests of Canada and the northern United States, we must first cross the Atlantic Ocean. Because the story begins not in North America, but in Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was changing. Trade was expanding. Cities were growing. Governments were becoming more powerful. Merchants were accumulating wealth on a scale that would have been difficult to imagine only a few generations earlier. The period was part of a broader transformation sometimes called the early modern era. New trade routes connected distant regions of the world. Ocean-going ships linked Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Goods moved farther and faster than ever before. And as commerce expanded, consumer demand expanded with it. People wanted products. Not only necessities, but also items that demonstrated status, success, and refinement. One of those items was the felt hat. Today, a hat may seem like a relatively minor accessory. But in early modern Europe, hats carried social significance. They were worn by merchants, government officials, military officers, craftsmen, and members of the nobility. A well-made hat could communicate respectability, prosperity, and position within society. The finest hats were often made from felt. Felt is a dense material created by compressing fibers together. Different animal furs could be used to make it, but manufacturers discovered that beaver fur possessed exceptional qualities. The soft underfur of the beaver created a strong, durable felt that resisted water and maintained its shape. Consumers loved it. Demand increased. Hat makers wanted more. Merchants wanted more. Investors wanted more. But there was a problem. European beaver populations had been declining for centuries. Large numbers had already been hunted across much of the continent. In many regions, beavers had become scarce. As demand increased and supply decreased, prices rose. And whenever prices rise, merchants begin searching for new sources. That search would eventually lead across the Atlantic. Yet before Europeans arrived in large numbers, North America already possessed its own rich and sophisticated history. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had lived across the continent. They adapted to deserts, forests, mountains, grasslands, river valleys, and Arctic environments. They developed governments, economies, spiritual traditions, technologies, and trade networks suited to their local conditions. Far from existing as isolated communities, many indigenous nations participated in extensive systems of exchange. Goods traveled remarkable distances. Copper from the Great Lakes moved through trade networks. Shells from coastal regions appeared hundreds of miles inland. Stone, food products, ceremonial objects, and tools circulated among different peoples. Trade helped create relationships. It encouraged diplomacy. It connected communities across enormous distances. Long before European maps existed, indigenous travelers possessed detailed knowledge of the continent's waterways. This knowledge would later become one of the most valuable resources in North America. Because rivers were the highways of the continent. Modern North Americans often think in terms of roads. People travel by automobile. Goods move by truck. Railways connect major cities. Airplanes cross vast distances in hours. But before modern transportation, rivers were often the fastest and most efficient routes available. A canoe could carry substantial cargo. A river required no construction. And throughout much of northeastern North America, waterways connected vast regions into an interconnected transportation system. Generations of indigenous travelers understood these routes. They knew where rivers connected. They knew where portages were necessary. A portage was a place where travelers carried canoes and supplies over land between waterways. Some portages were short. Others stretched for miles. Together, rivers and portages created transportation corridors that crossed much of the continent. When Europeans eventually entered the fur trade, they would rely heavily upon this indigenous knowledge. One reason the fur trade became so influential was geography. North America possessed an extraordinary abundance of fresh water. The Great Lakes alone contain roughly 1/5 of the world's surface fresh water. Thousands of rivers flow through forests, wetlands, and plains. For beavers, these environments were ideal. Beavers are ecosystem engineers. By building dams, they create ponds and wetlands. These environments support numerous plant and animal species. In the centuries before large-scale commercial hunting, North America supported enormous beaver populations. No one knows the exact number. Historians and environmental researchers have offered different estimates. But most agree that the population likely numbered in the many millions. To European merchants facing shortages at home, such abundance represented an extraordinary opportunity. Yet opportunities alone do not create trade. People must first establish contact. The earliest sustained contact between Europeans and northeastern North America often centered on something entirely different. Fish. The waters surrounding Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence were among the richest fishing grounds in the world. European fishermen discovered immense schools of cod. The demand for cod in Europe was substantial. Religious traditions encouraged the consumption of fish on certain days of the year. As a result, fishing fleets regularly crossed the Atlantic. French, English, Portuguese, and Basque fishermen all participated in these seasonal voyages. Among the most experienced were the Basques. Originating from regions along the border of present-day Spain and France, the Basques possessed centuries of maritime experience. They were skilled sailors, fishermen, and whalers. Many historians believe they were among the earliest Europeans to establish recurring trade relationships with indigenous peoples in parts of northeastern North America. At first, these exchanges were relatively small. European crews required local supplies. Indigenous communities recognized the usefulness of certain European goods. Metal tools attracted particular interest. An iron knife could perform tasks that previously required much more labor. Metal axes increased efficiency. Copper kettles offered practical advantages. These products entered indigenous economies through trade. At the same time, Europeans noticed something important. Indigenous hunters possessed access to large quantities of valuable animal pelts. At first, no one fully understood how significant this trade would become. But year after year, more furs crossed the Atlantic. And year after year, European demand remained strong. Merchants paid attention. Merchants always pay attention to profit. By the late 16th century, a pattern was becoming visible. The real wealth of northeastern North America was not concentrated along the coastline. It existed far inland, deep within forests stretching beyond the horizon, in regions accessible only through rivers, lakes, and indigenous trade routes. Reaching those regions would require a different approach. Seasonal fishing expeditions would not be enough. Permanent settlements would be necessary. Trading partnerships would be necessary. Diplomatic alliances would be necessary. And perhaps most importantly, Europeans would need to learn from the people who already knew the land. During the coming decades, French explorers, traders, missionaries, and settlers would move into the St. Lawrence Valley. They would establish communities. They would create alliances. They would build one of the most influential trade networks in North American history. The fur trade was still in its infancy. But the forces that would shape the next 3 centuries were already gathering. European demand was growing. Indigenous trade networks were thriving. North America's rivers waited like roads leading into an unknown world. And soon, those waterways would carry traders deep into the interior of a continent that would be transformed by fur. If you're enjoying tonight's journey through the fur trade that helped shape North America, please consider subscribing to Sleepy America. There are many more long-form history stories waiting for you. Now, let's continue our journey. By the beginning of the 17th century, European interest in North America was becoming more focused. For more than 100 years, ships had crossed the Atlantic in search of fish, whales, and trading opportunities. Sailors had mapped portions of the coastline. Merchants had learned that furs could generate impressive profits. Governments had begun to recognize that overseas territories might strengthen both wealth and power. Yet much of the continent remained a mystery to Europeans. Maps often contained large empty spaces. Rivers disappeared into unknown regions. Mountain ranges were rumored but not fully understood. And beyond the coastal settlements lay forests so vast that they seemed endless. To merchants, those forests represented opportunity. To governments, they represented territory. To explorers, they represented possibility. The fur trade stood at the center of all three. Among the European powers interested in North America, France would become one of the most influential participants in the early fur trade. French merchants recognized the value of beaver pelts. French governments understood that commerce could support imperial ambitions. And French explorers saw potential in the waterways leading deep into the interior. One of the most important figures in this story was Samuel de Champlain. Champlain is often remembered as an explorer, but he was much more than that. He was a navigator, mapmaker, diplomat, soldier, and strategist. Unlike many Europeans who imagined North America primarily as a source of treasure, Champlain believed that long-term success would depend upon trade and cooperation. Most importantly, he understood something that many newcomers initially failed to grasp. The future of French activity in North America would depend heavily upon relationships with indigenous nations. In 1608, Champlain founded Quebec along the St. Lawrence River. Today, Quebec is a major city. At the time, it was a small settlement positioned at one of the most strategically important locations in North America. The narrowing of the St. Lawrence River made the site useful for transportation and defense. More importantly, it served as a gateway to the interior. Any trader hoping to move westward toward the Great Lakes would likely pass through this region. Champlain hoped Quebec would become the center of a growing commercial network. To achieve that goal, alliances were essential. The French established relationships with several indigenous nations, including the Innu, Algonquin, and Wendat peoples. These alliances involved trade, diplomacy, and mutual assistance. Each side had its own reasons for cooperation. French traders wanted access to fur-producing regions. Indigenous nations sought valuable trade goods and strategic partnerships. Neither side entered these relationships without expectations. The alliances were practical, political, and economic at the same time. This is one reason the fur trade became so influential. It was never simply about buying and selling goods. Trade created obligations. Trade created partnerships. Trade created political relationships. A successful trader often needed diplomatic skills just as much as commercial knowledge. As French influence expanded along the St. Lawrence River, a larger economic system began to emerge. To understand that system, it helps to imagine the journey of a single beaver pelt. A hunter might obtain the pelt hundreds of miles from Quebec. The pelt could pass through multiple trading relationships before reaching a French merchant. The merchant would transport it to Quebec. From Quebec it would travel aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Once in France, it might be sold to wholesalers. Eventually it could reach a hat maker. The finished hat might then be purchased by a wealthy customer living in Paris. One product. Thousands of miles. Dozens of people involved. The fur trade connected distant worlds. In modern terms, we might describe it as part of a global supply chain. Although the technology was very different, the principle was remarkably similar. Resources extracted in one region moved through transportation networks, commercial systems, and manufacturing centers before reaching consumers elsewhere. The profits generated at each stage encouraged further expansion. This process was influenced by an economic philosophy that dominated much of Europe during the 17th century. Historians often refer to it as mercantilism. Mercantilism can seem complicated at first, but its basic idea was relatively simple. Governments believed that national wealth depended upon accumulating valuable resources and maintaining favorable trade balances. In other words, a country wanted to export more than it imported. Colonies played an important role within this system. They supplied raw materials. They provided markets for manufactured goods. And they helped strengthen the economic position of the mother country. From the perspective of French officials, North America offered valuable opportunities. The fur trade generated exports. Exports generated revenue. Revenues strengthened the kingdom. This connection between commerce and empire helps explain why governments became increasingly interested in controlling trade. Merchants sought profit. Governments sought power. The fur trade offered both. As trade expanded, French travelers pushed farther into the interior. Many of them became known as coureurs de bois. The phrase is often translated as runners of the woods. These men operated beyond the boundaries of established settlements. They traveled deep into indigenous territories seeking trade opportunities. Some worked independently. Others operated with informal support from merchants. Many adopted techniques learned from indigenous communities. They traveled by canoe. They learned survival skills. They adapted to unfamiliar environments. Some formed families with indigenous women, creating personal and economic connections that linked different communities together. French officials often had mixed feelings about the coureurs de bois. On one hand, they expanded trade. On the other hand, they were difficult to control. Governments generally prefer systems that can be regulated and taxed. Independent traders did not always fit neatly within official plans. Yet despite these concerns, the coureurs de bois helped extend French influence into regions that few Europeans had previously visited. They became important intermediaries between different worlds. Their experiences also revealed something increasingly clear. The fur trade was moving westward. The most accessible hunting territories near established trade routes were gradually becoming less productive. Beavers remained abundant in many areas, but merchants constantly sought new sources of supply. Economic success encouraged expansion. Expansion encouraged exploration. Exploration increased geographic knowledge. The process fed upon itself. Each successful trading season created incentives to push farther into the interior. And the farther traders traveled, the more they learned about the immense scale of North America. Reports returned to Quebec describing vast lakes, powerful rivers, fertile lands, and distant nations. Some accounts were accurate. Others were exaggerated. A few were entirely mistaken. Yet together they created a growing sense that the continent was far larger and more complex than Europeans had imagined. Meanwhile, indigenous nations carefully evaluated the changing situation. Participation in the fur trade brought advantages. European goods could improve efficiency and strengthen regional influence. But participation also created new dependencies. Communities increasingly integrated trade goods into daily life. Economic relationships became more important. Competition intensified. As the value of fur increased, access to hunting territories and trade routes became more significant than ever. The consequences would soon become dramatic. Throughout the Great Lakes region and the northeastern interior, rivalries that had existed for generations began interacting with the new realities of the fur trade. Economic pressures combined with political ambitions. Access to trade became a source of power. And power was something many nations sought to protect. The result would be a period of conflict that reshaped much of northeastern North America. Historians would later call these struggles the Beaver Wars. But as we will soon discover, the story was about far more than beavers. To understand why the coming conflicts became so intense, we must remember that the fur trade was creating winners and losers. Communities with strong access to European goods often gained advantages over their neighbors. Nations positioned along major trade routes could increase their influence. Groups that controlled important transportation corridors often found themselves in powerful bargaining positions. At the same time, the growing demand for furs encouraged increased hunting. As local beaver populations declined in some areas, hunters traveled farther. Trade networks expanded. Competition increased. What had once been a regional economic activity was becoming an international business connected to European markets. And whenever large amounts of money become involved, competition tends to follow. The forests of North America remained vast and beautiful. Rivers still flowed quietly toward distant oceans. But beneath that calm landscape, powerful forces were beginning to move. Commerce, ambition, diplomacy, empire. All were becoming intertwined within the growing fur trade. And in the decades ahead, those forces would transform the history of a continent. By the middle of the 17th century, the fur trade had become one of the most valuable economic activities in northeastern North America. What had begun as a relatively small exchange between indigenous hunters and European merchants was evolving into a vast commercial system. Beaver pelts moved through forests, along rivers, across oceans, and into workshops where they would eventually become fashionable hats worn by people who knew little about the distant lands from which the fur had come. Yet, as the value of the trade increased, so did the competition surrounding it. The struggle that followed would become one of the most significant periods in the history of early North America. To understand that struggle, we must first understand the political landscape of the region. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous nations had developed their own alliances, rivalries, trade relationships, and diplomatic traditions. The arrival of Europeans did not create politics in North America. It entered an existing political world. Among the most influential powers in the Northeast was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often known in English as the Iroquois Confederacy. The Confederacy was not a single tribe. It was a sophisticated alliance of nations that had united under a system of cooperation designed to reduce conflict among themselves while strengthening their collective position. The exact origins of the Confederacy remain a subject of historical study, but by the time Europeans arrived, it had already become an important political force. The Confederacy occupied a strategic region south of Lake Ontario. This location placed it near important transportation routes and trade networks. As European commerce expanded, geography became increasingly important. A nation positioned near major trade corridors possessed advantages that could influence both economic and political power. At first, European trade brought opportunities to many indigenous communities. Metal tools improved efficiency. New goods entered local economies. Commercial relationships created access to valuable resources. But trade also altered existing balances of power. Communities with stronger access to European goods often gained advantages over their rivals. This reality encouraged competition. At the same time, demand for beaver pelts remained extremely high. Throughout Europe, hat makers continued purchasing large quantities of fur. Merchants continued seeking profits. Investors continued funding commercial ventures. The economic incentives remained powerful. As hunting intensified in some regions, local beaver populations began to decline. This did not mean beavers disappeared entirely. North America still contained enormous numbers of them. However, hunters in certain areas often needed to travel farther to obtain profitable quantities of fur. Access to hunting territories therefore became increasingly important. Economic concerns combined with political and military considerations. The result was a complex period of conflict that historians now refer to as the Beaver Wars. The term is useful, but it can also be misleading. These conflicts were never solely about beavers. They involved trade, territory, security, diplomacy, migration, and survival. Fur was one important factor among many. The wars unfolded over decades rather than years. Different nations participated at different times. Alliances shifted. Circumstances changed. The situation was rarely simple. Nevertheless, the fur trade remained an important force shaping events. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy sought to strengthen its position within the expanding commercial system. French allies such as the Wendat and Algonquin nations pursued their own interests. European powers attempted to support trading partners who could help maintain access to valuable fur supplies. The consequences spread across much of the northeastern interior. Communities relocated. Trade routes changed. Political influence shifted. Military campaigns affected large regions. Throughout this period, firearms played an increasingly important role. European weapons did not immediately transform warfare in North America. Early firearms were often slow to reload and sometimes unreliable. Yet over time, access to guns and ammunition became a significant advantage. As trade relationships developed, different nations gained varying levels of access to these resources. This added another layer of complexity to regional politics. Modern discussions sometimes portray indigenous nations as passive participants caught between competing European empires. The reality was very different. Indigenous leaders pursued their own goals. They negotiated alliances based on their own interests. They adapted to changing circumstances with remarkable flexibility. European officials frequently discovered that indigenous diplomacy was far more sophisticated than they had expected. Successful trade required more than goods. It required relationships. A merchant who failed to maintain trust could quickly lose access to valuable partners. A government that ignored indigenous concerns often found its plans disrupted. Diplomacy became as important as commerce. Across much of North America, political relationships and economic relationships were closely connected. This pattern would continue throughout the history of the fur trade. While conflict affected parts of the Northeast, trade itself continued to expand. The profits were simply too attractive to ignore. French traders pushed farther into the interior. Indigenous trading networks extended commercial connections across vast distances. Every year, canoes carried additional cargo through the waterways of the continent. The Great Lakes region became increasingly important. The lakes formed one of the most remarkable transportation systems in the world. Lake Ontario connected to Lake Erie. Lake Erie connected to Lake Huron. Lake Huron connected to Lake Superior. Together they created pathways reaching deep into the continent. Travelers moving through these waters could access territories that Europeans had barely begun to understand. Each journey expanded geographic knowledge. Each expedition produced new reports. Each successful season encouraged further exploration. In this way, the fur trade became one of the great engines of discovery. Merchants wanted furs. But obtaining those furs required information. Where were the best hunting territories? Which rivers connected to distant regions? Which nations controlled important trade routes? Where could new trading relationships be established? Answering these questions required travel. And travel produced knowledge. Maps improved. Routes became better understood. The geographic picture of North America slowly became clearer. Yet despite these advances, enormous areas remained unknown to Europeans. Beyond the Great Lakes stretched vast forests, plains, and river systems. Some travelers believed these waterways might eventually lead to the Pacific Ocean. Others imagined a route that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific worlds through the interior. The dream of a transcontinental passage captured many imaginations. Merchants hoped such a route might improve trade. Governments hoped it might strengthen imperial influence. Explorers hoped it might bring fame. Although those ambitions would take many decades to unfold, the fur trade was already pushing people in that direction. The search for beaver pelts was gradually becoming a search for the continent itself. As the 17th century progressed, another important lesson became increasingly clear. The future of the fur trade depended upon transportation. A valuable beaver pelt was useless if it could not reach market. Goods arriving from Europe were useless if they could not reach trading partners in the interior. The movement of products was therefore just as important as the products themselves. This reality encouraged constant innovation in logistics and organization. Merchants studied routes. Traders improved supply systems. Governments sought strategic locations. Every participant understood that control of transportation meant control of opportunity. And soon, attention would turn toward a vast inland sea to the north. A region that promised direct access to some of the richest fur-producing territories on the continent. That region was Hudson Bay. And its discovery would change the fur trade forever. The idea seemed almost unbelievable. Somewhere far to the north, beyond the familiar routes of the St. Lawrence River, lay a vast inland sea connected to some of the richest fur-producing territories in North America. If merchants could reach that sea directly by ship, they might gain access to enormous quantities of fur without traveling thousands of miles through the interior. For years, such possibilities remained little more than speculation. Then two experienced traders began arguing that the opportunity was very real. Their names were Pierre-Esprit Radisson and Métis de Groseilliers. Both men had spent years traveling through the interior of North America. Unlike officials sitting in distant offices, they had seen the fur country firsthand. They had spoken with indigenous traders. They had traveled to regions that many Europeans had never visited. And they believed they understood something important. The richest opportunities of the future might lie not along the St. Lawrence River, but farther north. According to accounts from the period, Radisson and de Groseilliers heard repeated reports about northern territories rich in fur-bearing animals. The challenge was finding an efficient way to access those resources. The traditional route through the St. Lawrence system worked, but it required long and difficult journeys. The two traders proposed a different approach. Ships could sail directly into Hudson Bay. Trading posts could be established along the coast. Indigenous hunters and traders could bring furs to those posts. The result might be a more efficient commercial network. At first, French authorities showed little enthusiasm. Whether because of political disagreements, commercial concerns, or simple skepticism, the proposal failed to receive the support its advocates desired. For Radisson and de Groseilliers, this rejection proved frustrating. They believed they had identified a major opportunity. Yet opportunity means little without investment. Unable to secure sufficient backing in New France, they eventually turned elsewhere. Their search led them to England. There, influential merchants and political leaders viewed the proposal with growing interest. England and France were already rivals in many parts of the world. If the northern route worked, England might gain direct access to a valuable source of wealth. The potential rewards were enormous. In 1668, an expedition was organized to test the idea. One of the ships involved was the Nonsuch. Although small by modern standards, the vessel would become famous in the history of North America. The voyage succeeded. The expedition returned with a profitable cargo of furs and convincing evidence that trade through Hudson Bay was possible. Investors paid attention. Governments paid attention. And when governments and investors become excited about the same opportunity, major developments often follow. In 1670, King Charles II granted a royal charter establishing the Hudson's Bay Company. The new company received privileges that were extraordinary even by the standards of the time. To understand why, it helps to remember how European empires often operated during the 17th century. Governments did not always possess the resources necessary to directly manage distant territories. Exploration was expensive. Trade networks were expensive. Military protection was expensive. Rather than paying all of those costs themselves, governments frequently relied upon chartered companies. A chartered company was a private business that received official rights and privileges from the state. Investors supplied capital. Governments supplied legal authority. Both sides hoped to benefit. The arrangement allowed expansion without requiring the government to bear every financial burden. The Hudson's Bay Company became one of the most successful examples of this model. Its charter granted control over a massive territory known as Rupert's Land. The region was named after Prince Rupert, an influential supporter of the enterprise and a cousin of the king. The scale of Rupert's Land was astonishing. Instead of defining the territory through modern political boundaries, the charter used geography. The company received rights to all lands whose rivers flowed into Hudson Bay. At first glance, this may sound straightforward. In reality, it encompassed an immense portion of northern North America. Millions of square miles fell under the company's authority. A private corporation suddenly possessed influence over an area larger than many European kingdoms. This fact reveals something important about the fur trade. The trade was not merely a business. It was becoming a system capable of shaping political geography. Commercial interests and imperial ambitions were increasingly intertwined. For England, the company represented more than an economic opportunity. It represented a strategic foothold in North America. Every successful trading post strengthened English influence. Every profitable season increased the value of continued expansion. Every alliance created new opportunities. The company's leaders moved quickly. Trading posts appeared along the shores of Hudson Bay and James Bay. These posts served as centers of exchange where indigenous traders could bring furs and obtain European goods. Among the most important locations were Fort Albany, Moose Factory, and York Factory. The names can sometimes be confusing. Modern readers often imagine factories as industrial facilities filled with machinery. In the 17th century, the term meant something different. A factory was a trading station managed by a factor, or commercial agent. The purpose of these posts was trade, storage, and administration. Life at such locations could be challenging. The climate around Hudson Bay was severe. Winters were long and intensely cold. Ice often dominated the landscape for much of the year. Supply ships could only arrive during relatively short seasons. If shipments failed to appear, shortages could become serious. Employees frequently lived in isolation. Months might pass without contact from the outside world. Yet despite these hardships, people continued arriving. The profits justified the risks. Fur remained one of the most valuable commodities in the Atlantic economy. As long as European consumers wanted beaver hats, merchants would seek beaver pelts. And as long as merchants sought beaver pelts, the fur trade would continue expanding. The Hudson's Bay Company soon developed a distinctive business strategy. Unlike many French traders who traveled deep into the interior, company officials often preferred to remain near the bay. Instead of going to the hunters, they encouraged hunters and traders to come to them. From a business perspective, the logic was clear. Long-distance expeditions were expensive. They required labor, supplies, and transportation. A coastal trading system reduced many of those costs. The approach also reveals an important economic principle. Businesses often seek efficiency. The company wanted to move the greatest quantity of valuable goods at the lowest possible cost. In theory, Hudson Bay offered precisely that opportunity. Whether the strategy would succeed on a large scale remained uncertain. But one thing was already clear. A powerful new competitor had entered the fur trade. And the merchants of New France were watching closely. The struggle between the French trading network and the Hudson's Bay Company would shape the future of North America for generations to come. The emergence of the Hudson's Bay Company changed the fur trade in ways that reached far beyond commerce. For decades, French traders operating from the St. Lawrence River had enjoyed important advantages. Their alliances stretched deep into the interior. Their voyagers traveled immense distances. Their trading partners connected them to regions that many Europeans had never seen. Now a rival system existed. And unlike a single merchant or trading expedition, this rival possessed a royal charter, wealthy investors, and control over a territory larger than many countries. Competition was inevitable. The question was how that competition would unfold. To understand the rivalry, it is helpful to compare the two systems. The French model relied heavily upon movement. Traders traveled inland. Voyagers carried goods through rivers and lakes. Trading relationships were maintained across enormous distances. French commerce often depended upon personal connections built through years of interaction. The Hudson's Bay Company favored a different approach. Its officials hoped indigenous traders would bring furs to coastal posts. Instead of sending large numbers of employees into the interior, the company concentrated resources at strategic locations along the bay. Both systems possessed strengths. Both possessed weaknesses. The French network could reach distant regions and establish direct relationships with communities far from the coast. The Hudson's Bay Company could reduce transportation costs and maintain centralized control. For many years, either side achieved complete dominance. Instead, the rivalry encouraged expansion. Each competitor searched for new opportunities. Each sought stronger alliances. Each tried to secure access to the most productive hunting territories. The result was a steady push farther into the continent. This process reveals one of the most important themes in the history of North America. Exploration was often driven by economics. People sometimes imagine explorers setting out primarily because of curiosity. Curiosity certainly played a role. But financial incentives were often just as important. Merchants wanted profits. Companies wanted growth. Governments wanted wealth and influence. The fur trade provided reasons to invest in geographic knowledge. A new river might lead to new customers. A new route might reduce transportation costs. A new alliance might open access to valuable resources. As a result, commerce and exploration became closely connected. The search for furs encouraged the search for information. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, This relationship transformed European understanding of North America. Maps became more detailed. Travel routes became better known. Reports from traders expanded geographic knowledge. Yet enormous regions still remained poorly understood. The continent was simply too large. Even experienced travelers could spend months moving through wilderness without encountering permanent European settlements. To many newcomers, the scale of North America seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A person could paddle for weeks and still remain within the same river system. Forests stretched across horizons. Lakes appeared so large that they resembled inland seas. Distances that seemed manageable on modern maps often required extraordinary effort to cross. This geography shaped the fur trade. Large-scale agricultural settlement remained limited in many northern regions. The climate was often challenging. Transportation depended heavily upon waterways. As a result, trade became one of the primary ways Europeans interacted with vast areas of the continent. A trading post might represent the only permanent European presence for hundreds of miles. Around these posts developed a distinctive world. Languages mixed. Cultures interacted. Economic relationships formed. Information circulated. In many respects, the fur trade frontier was one of the most multicultural regions in early North America. French, English, Scottish, Irish, Indigenous, and eventually Métis participants all contributed to its development. The fur trade therefore cannot be understood as a story of Europeans acting alone. Without indigenous knowledge, transportation skills, hunting expertise, and commercial participation, the system would have been impossible. European traders depended upon indigenous communities in countless ways. They relied upon local geographic knowledge. They relied upon hunting networks. They relied upon diplomatic relationships. And often, they relied upon indigenous technologies. Consider the canoe. Many European boats were excellent for oceans. They were less suitable for navigating narrow rivers, shallow waters, and frequent portages. Indigenous canoe designs solved these problems. Lightweight birch bark canoes could travel through environments that larger vessels could not reach. They became essential tools of the fur trade. In a similar way, indigenous knowledge of winter travel proved invaluable. Snowshoes allowed movement across deep snow. Local survival techniques helped travelers endure harsh conditions. Knowledge accumulated over generations became a practical resource within the expanding commercial system. These realities often challenged European assumptions. Many newcomers arrived believing they possessed superior knowledge. The realities of the North American wilderness quickly taught otherwise. Success required adaptation. Those who learned from experienced local communities generally performed better than those who ignored such knowledge. The fur trade became a place where practical experience often mattered more than social status. A wealthy merchant sitting in Europe might finance an expedition. But survival in the interior depended upon people who understood the land. This was one reason experienced voyagers and guides became so valuable. Their knowledge could determine whether a journey succeeded or failed. As the 18th century progressed, another important development began to emerge. A growing number of families connected different cultures through marriage and kinship. European traders frequently spent long periods away from colonial settlements. Many formed relationships with indigenous women. These unions often strengthened commercial ties and created important social connections. Over time, entire communities developed from these relationships. Their descendants would play a crucial role in the future of the fur trade. Eventually, many of these communities became associated with a distinct people known as the Métis. The history of the Métis is complex and deserves careful attention. For now, it is enough to recognize that the fur trade was not merely exchanging goods. It was creating new societies. Economic systems often influence culture. The fur trade was no exception. People adapted to changing circumstances. New identities emerged. New communities appeared. And these developments would become increasingly important as the trade expanded westward. Meanwhile, the rivalry between European empires continued. France and England competed in Europe. They competed on the oceans. And they competed in North America. The fur trade was one of the prizes they sought. But the struggle was about more than profit. Control of trade routes could strengthen political influence. Control of territory could shape future settlement. Control of resources could support military power. In other words, commerce and empire were becoming inseparable. As the 18th century advanced, traders, explorers, and governments would push farther west than ever before. Beyond the Great Lakes lay immense regions that few Europeans had visited. Some hoped those regions contained new sources of wealth. Others believed they might hold routes leading all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The search for fur was gradually becoming a search for a continent. And in the years ahead, that search would carry traders into some of the most remote landscapes in North America, opening a new chapter in the story of the fur trade that helped build a nation. By the early 18th century, the fur trade had become one of the largest economic enterprises in North America. Yet despite its importance, it remained remarkably fragile. The entire system depended upon a chain of relationships stretching across thousands of miles. A hunter in the interior needed access to trading partners. Those trading partners needed transportation routes. Merchants needed ships. Manufacturers needed raw materials. Consumers needed to continue buying finished products. If any link weakened, the entire chain could feel the effects. This reality helps explain why fur traders paid such close attention to both geography and politics. A river blocked by conflict could disrupt commerce. An alliance broken by misunderstanding could close a valuable trade route. A change in fashion in Europe could affect communities on the far side of the Atlantic. Few industries demonstrated the interconnected nature of the early modern world more clearly than the fur trade. As profits increased, European governments became increasingly interested in controlling territory. At first glance, this may seem surprising. After all, a beaver lives in wetlands, not palaces. Yet governments understood an important principle. Resources generate wealth. Wealth supports power. And power often determines the success of nations. The 17th and 18th centuries were periods of intense competition among European states. Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and other powers all sought advantages in trade and empire. Colonies were viewed not merely as distant possessions but as valuable assets within a larger economic system. The fur trade fit neatly into this worldview. A successful trading network could generate revenue. Revenue could support armies and navies. Military strength could protect commercial interests. Commercial interests could generate additional revenue. The cycle reinforced itself. This relationship between commerce and government helps explain why fur trading companies sometimes possess powers that seem unusual today. Modern corporations generally operate within political systems. The great chartered companies of the early modern era often helped shape those systems. The Hudson's Bay Company is a good example. Although it was a business, it also exercised governmental authority across vast territories. Company officials established posts. They negotiated agreements. They enforced rules. In some cases, they effectively governed remote regions where no other European institution possessed a significant presence. To modern observers, the arrangement can appear strange. Yet for people living at the time, it often seemed practical. Governments lacked the resources to directly administer every distant territory. Companies supplied money, organization, and manpower. In return, they received privileges and opportunities. This system became one of the defining features of imperial expansion. Meanwhile, life in the fur country continued according to rhythms very different from those of Europe. A trading post operated on seasonal cycles. The arrival of supply ships brought excitement. The departure of trading expeditions created anticipation. Winter imposed limitations. Spring opened routes. Summer encouraged travel. Autumn often became a period of preparation. Everything depended upon timing. Missing a seasonal opportunity could create serious problems. A delayed shipment might leave a post short of essential supplies. An early freeze could trap travelers far from their destination. Nature remained a powerful force. The fur trade operated within environments that could not easily be controlled. Success often depended upon patience, planning, and adaptability. One reason many traders admired indigenous knowledge was because it reflected generations of experience with these realities. Indigenous hunters understood animal behavior. They knew seasonal patterns. They recognized subtle changes in weather and landscape. Such knowledge could not be acquired quickly. It developed through observation accumulated across lifetimes. European newcomers who respected that expertise often achieved better results than those who dismissed it. Over time, the fur trade produced individuals who moved comfortably between different worlds. Interpreters learned multiple languages. Guides traveled across vast territories. Traders developed relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. These people became essential participants in the commercial system. Their skills allowed information to move alongside goods. And information was becoming increasingly valuable. As traders traveled farther west, reports returned describing new regions. Some accounts spoke of enormous grasslands beyond the forests. Others described mountain ranges rising in the distance. Still others mentioned rivers flowing toward unknown destinations. For merchants, such reports suggested opportunity. For mapmakers, they suggested questions. For governments, they suggested future claims. The fur trade therefore functioned as a network for gathering intelligence as well as commerce. Every expedition contributed to a growing understanding of North American geography. Every journey added new details to maps. Every conversation expanded knowledge. This process was gradual. No single explorer suddenly revealed the entire continent. Instead, understanding accumulated piece by piece. One river at a time. One lake at a time. One trading relationship at a time. The result was a slow but profound transformation in European knowledge. A continent that had once appeared largely mysterious was becoming increasingly familiar. Not completely understood. Not fully mapped. But better known than before. The search for furs played a major role in that process. In fact, some historians have argued that the fur trade accomplished something remarkable. It encouraged exploration across areas where large-scale settlement remained limited. Unlike agricultural colonies, which often concentrated populations in specific regions, the fur trade rewarded mobility. Traders moved where opportunities existed. That movement carried people into distant territories. And wherever traders traveled, information followed. As a result, the commercial geography of the fur trade often expanded faster than the geography of settlement. By the early 18th century, Europeans possessed trading connections that stretched astonishing distances into the interior. Yet much of that system still depended upon waterways. Rivers remained the highways of North America. And among all the people who traveled those highways, few became more important than the voyagers. The voyagers were not wealthy merchants. They were not government officials. They were not famous explorers. Yet without them, much of the fur trade would have been impossible. A voyageur's work demanded extraordinary endurance. Long hours of paddling were routine. Heavy loads had to be carried across portages. Weather conditions could change rapidly. Insects could be relentless. Accidents were always possible. Despite these challenges, thousands of men participated in the trade over the centuries. Their labor connected distant regions of North America. The voyagers moved goods. They moved information. They moved people. In many ways, they were the transportation infrastructure of the fur trade. And as commercial competition intensified during the 18th century, their importance would only grow. Because a new phase of the fur trade was approaching. A phase that would push commerce deeper into the continent than ever before and eventually create one of the most formidable business rivals the Hudson's Bay Company had ever faced. For much of its early history, the Hudson's Bay Company appeared secure. Its trading posts stood along the shores of Hudson Bay. Its ships connected North America to European markets. Its royal charter granted extraordinary privileges. And its investors enjoyed the profits generated by a thriving trade. Yet success often attracts competition. By the middle of the 18th century, a new challenge was beginning to emerge from the city of Montreal. Montreal occupied a strategic position within the fur trade network. Located along the St. Lawrence River, it served as a gateway between the settled regions of New France and the vast interior beyond the Great Lakes. Merchants there understood the trade intimately. They knew the routes. They knew the markets. And they knew that enormous opportunities still existed farther west. Unlike the Hudson's Bay Company, which generally preferred to wait near Hudson Bay for traders to arrive, Montreal merchants favored a more aggressive approach. If furs existed in the interior, they intended to go and find them. This difference in strategy would eventually reshape the entire industry. To appreciate why, it helps to understand a basic economic principle. Businesses often compete in two ways. One method focuses on efficiency. The other focuses on expansion. The Hudson's Bay Company emphasized efficiency. Its coastal trading posts reduced transportation costs and centralized operations. Montreal traders emphasized expansion. They pushed deeper into the continent, seeking direct access to new sources of fur. Both strategies could be profitable. But when pursued simultaneously, they often create intense rivalry. During the decades after the British conquest of New France in 1763, economic conditions began changing. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, dramatically altered the political landscape. France lost most of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi River. Britain emerged as the dominant imperial power in the region. At first glance, one might expect such changes to disrupt the fur trade. Instead, many commercial networks continued operating. Trade remained too valuable to abandon. Merchants adapted to the new political realities. Former French trading routes remained active. Experienced voyagers continued traveling into the interior. Indigenous nations continued participating in commerce. The demand for fur remained strong. The business endured. In fact, the post-war period created opportunities for ambitious entrepreneurs. Without the restrictions imposed by imperial rivalry between France and Britain, merchants began organizing larger and more ambitious commercial ventures. Many of these ventures originated in Montreal. The city became a center of commercial energy. Investors pooled resources. Partnerships formed. Expeditions expanded. The scale of operations increased. By the late 18th century, these efforts would lead to the creation of one of the most famous organizations in the history of the fur trade, the Northwest Company. Although the company evolved gradually rather than appearing overnight, historians generally trace its origins to the growing cooperation among Montreal merchants seeking to compete more effectively. The challenge they faced was substantial. The Hudson's Bay Company possessed powerful advantages. It had established infrastructure. It had financial resources. It had legal privileges. To challenge such a rival, Montreal merchants needed organization. The Northwest Company provided it. The company developed a remarkably sophisticated business model. Partners in Montreal supplied capital. Goods were purchased and transported westward. Trading posts were established deep within the interior. Voyageurs carried supplies. Indigenous trading networks provided access to fur-producing regions. Furs eventually returned eastward for sale in international markets. The distances involved were extraordinary. A single trading network could stretch thousands of miles across forests, lakes, rivers, and plains. Coordinating such an enterprise required careful planning. Communication was slow. Transportation was difficult. Yet somehow the system functioned. One reason for its success was specialization. Different participants performed different roles. Merchants managed investments. Clerks kept records. Interpreters facilitated communication. Guides provided local knowledge. Voyageurs transported goods. Hunters supplied furs. The trade became a complex economic machine. Not a machine made of steel and gears, but a machine made of relationships, labor, and information. Its efficiency was impressive. Its reach was enormous. And its ambitions continued growing. As competition intensified, traders moved farther west than ever before. The Great Lakes no longer represented the edge of commercial activity. They became stepping stones. Beyond them lay immense territories rich in fur-bearing animals. Every new region offered opportunities. Every new route offered advantages. Every successful expedition encouraged additional investment. The fur trade entered a period of remarkable expansion. This expansion transformed the geography of commerce. Maps that once focused primarily on the St. Lawrence River now stretched toward the northwest. Remote rivers acquired economic significance. Portages became strategic assets. Lakes served as transportation corridors. The interior of North America increasingly appeared not as empty wilderness but as a connected network of commercial possibilities. The people moving through this world developed extraordinary skills. Many voyageurs traveled thousands of miles during their careers. Some became famous for their endurance. Others became known for their navigational expertise. Most remained largely anonymous. Yet collectively they accomplished something remarkable. They helped create one of the largest transportation systems in the world before the age of railroads. Long before locomotives crossed the continent, canoes carried commerce across vast distances. And those canoes helped build fortunes. By the late 18th century, profits from the fur trade were supporting merchants in Montreal, investors in Britain, and businesses across the Atlantic world. The trade linked local economies to global markets. A beaver harvested in the interior might eventually contribute to wealth generated thousands of miles away. This was globalization in an earlier form. Slower than modern systems. Smaller in scale. But driven by similar principles. Resources moved from areas of abundance to areas of demand. Transportation connected distant regions. Information guided investment. Economic incentives encouraged expansion. The fur trade embodied all of these processes. And as traders pushed farther west, they began hearing reports about lands beyond the limits of their existing knowledge. Reports of enormous rivers. Reports of endless grasslands. Reports of mountain ranges rising on the horizon. And perhaps most intriguing of all, reports suggesting that a route to the Pacific Ocean might exist somewhere beyond the interior. For generations, Europeans had dreamed of finding a practical route across North America. Such a route promised commercial advantages and geographic prestige. Now fur traders found themselves in a position to search for it. Because every mile traveled in pursuit of fur also expanded knowledge of the continent. And the next great phase of exploration would be driven not by kings or armies, but by merchants seeking profit. Among the many individuals drawn into this expanding world were explorers whose names would become famous in North American history. Some sought wealth. Some sought adventure. Some sought geographic knowledge. Most sought a combination of all three. Their journeys would carry them into regions that few Europeans had ever seen. They would map rivers, cross plains, and eventually reach the shores of the Pacific. And in doing so, they would help reveal the true scale of North America. The fur trade had begun as a search for beaver pelts. It was becoming a search for an entire continent. By the late 18th century, the fur trade was no longer confined to the forests surrounding the Great Lakes or the shores of Hudson Bay. Its influence now stretched deep into the interior of North America. Merchants wanted new sources of fur. Companies wanted new trading partners. Governments wanted stronger claims to territory. And explorers wanted answers to questions that had fascinated Europeans for centuries. How large was North America? Where did its great rivers lead? Could a practical route be found across the continent? The search for fur increasingly overlapped with the search for geography. Few individuals illustrate this connection better than Alexander Mackenzie. Today, Mackenzie is remembered as one of the great explorers of North American history. But it is important to remember that he did not set out simply to satisfy curiosity. Like many explorers of the fur trade era, he was deeply connected to commerce. His journeys emerged from the economic ambitions of the Northwest Company. The company understood that geographic knowledge could create commercial advantages. A trader who discovered a new route might gain access to untapped regions. A company that reached new markets could increase profits. Exploration therefore became an investment. Knowledge itself acquired economic value. Alexander Mackenzie was born in Scotland in 1764. As a young man, he eventually became involved in the fur trade and joined the Northwest Company. His intelligence, ambition, and determination soon attracted attention. By the 1780s, he was operating in regions far beyond the settled areas of eastern Canada. These were frontier territories in the truest sense. Communication with the outside world was slow. Transportation depended upon rivers and canoes. The distances involved were immense. Yet Mackenzie believed there were opportunities farther west. At the time, European understanding of the continent remained incomplete. Some people hoped that a river flowing westward might provide access to the Pacific Ocean. Such a route could potentially transform commerce. A transcontinental connection would shorten certain trade networks and strengthen imperial influence. The dream of reaching the Pacific was not new. Explorers had pursued variations of it for generations. What made Mackenzie's efforts different was the practical experience he gained through the fur trade. He was operating within an existing network of transportation and information. Indigenous knowledge, trading routes, and commercial infrastructure all contributed to the possibility of exploration. In 1789, Mackenzie launched an ambitious expedition. His goal was to follow a major river system that many hoped might lead to the Pacific. The journey was difficult. The river was immense. Its course remained uncertain. The farther the expedition traveled, the more obvious it became that the river was heading north rather than west. Eventually Mackenzie reached the Arctic Ocean. Although he had not found a route to the Pacific, the expedition remained historically significant. The river would later bear his name. Today it is known as the Mackenzie River. The journey dramatically expanded European geographic knowledge. It also demonstrated a recurring reality of exploration. Even unsuccessful expeditions often produce valuable information. Mackenzie had failed to reach the Pacific. But he had learned where one major route did not lead. That knowledge mattered. Maps improved. Future explorers could plan more effectively. And perhaps most importantly, Mackenzie remained determined. Many people would have viewed the outcome as a disappointment. He viewed it as a lesson. Over the following years, he prepared for another attempt. This time he focused on a more southerly route. The effort required careful planning. The terrain was challenging. The distances were enormous. Success depended heavily upon indigenous guides and local knowledge. Like many explorers of the fur trade era, Mackenzie did not travel through empty land. He moved through regions that indigenous peoples already knew. Their knowledge helped make exploration possible. In 1793, Mackenzie set out once again. The expedition traveled through river systems, crossed difficult terrain, and eventually reached the western side of the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains represented one of the great geographic barriers of North America. Stretching thousands of miles, they divided watersheds and complicated travel. Crossing them was a formidable challenge. Yet Mackenzie and his companions continued westward. Finally, after months of effort, they reached the Pacific coast. Mackenzie had accomplished something extraordinary. More than a decade before the famous Lewis and Clark expedition began in the United States, he had completed an overland crossing of North America north of Mexico. The achievement carried both symbolic and practical significance. From a symbolic perspective, it demonstrated that the continent could be crossed. From a practical perspective, it improved geographic understanding and strengthened commercial ambitions. The Northwest Company paid close attention. So did British officials. Exploration and trade were becoming inseparable. Every new route offered economic possibilities. Every geographic discovery created strategic opportunities. And every successful expedition encouraged further expansion. Mackenzie's achievements also reveal something important about the fur trade. The trade was never simply about beavers. By this stage, it had become one of the primary engines driving exploration across northern North America. The pursuit of profit encouraged the pursuit of knowledge. Companies financed journeys because they hoped knowledge would create advantages. In many cases, they were correct. The maps produced by traders and explorers helped shape future settlement patterns, transportation routes, and territorial claims. Long after the beaver trade declined, many of those geographic discoveries continued influencing the continent. As the 18th century approached its end, the fur trade network continued expanding. New posts appeared. New routes opened. New regions entered the commercial system. The interior of North America was becoming increasingly interconnected. Yet despite all this growth, much of the continent remained imperfectly understood. One of the greatest mapmakers in North American history was about to change that. His name was David Thompson. Over the course of his career, Thompson would travel tens of thousands of miles, map enormous territories, and create some of the most accurate geographic information of his era. His work would influence traders, explorers, governments, and settlers for generations. And like Alexander Mackenzie, his achievements emerged directly from the world of the fur trade. Because by the end of the 18th century, the fur trade was doing something remarkable. It was not merely transporting goods across North America. It was revealing the continent itself. In the summer of 1797, a young apprentice of the Hudson's Bay Company stepped onto the shores of Hudson Bay and entered a world that would shape the rest of his life. His name was David Thompson. At the time, few people could have guessed that he would become one of the greatest mapmakers in North American history. He was not born into wealth. He was not a famous explorer. And he certainly did not arrive with the expectation that future generations would study his journeys. Like many young men entering the fur trade, he was simply seeking opportunity. Yet the fur trade had a remarkable way of transforming ordinary people into extraordinary travelers. Thompson arrived at a moment when competition was intensifying across the continent. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company were locked in a struggle that extended far beyond profits. Each company wanted better routes. Each wanted stronger trading relationships. Each wanted greater knowledge of the interior. And knowledge was becoming one of the most valuable commodities in North America. A trader who knew a river system possessed an advantage. A company that understood geography possessed power. A map could be worth a fortune. Today, maps are easy to take for granted. A smartphone can display roads, rivers, cities, and mountains within seconds. In the 18th century, things were very different. Large portions of North America remained imperfectly mapped. Distances were uncertain. River connections were sometimes misunderstood. Entire regions existed as blank spaces on European maps. For merchants planning expensive expeditions, such uncertainty created problems. The fur trade needed accurate information. And David Thompson possessed exactly the sort of mind that could provide it. From an early age, he showed unusual talent in mathematics and observation. The Hudson's Bay Company recognized his abilities and assigned him responsibilities involving surveying and navigation. At first, the work may have seemed routine. Measuring distances, recording locations, tracking routes. But every observation contributed to something larger. Little by little, Thompson was helping create a more accurate picture of a continent. His work required extraordinary patience. Travel in the fur country was rarely easy. Canoes moved through powerful currents. Portages crossed difficult terrain. Storms could delay progress. Winter created additional challenges. Yet year after year, Thompson continued gathering information. He observed rivers. He measured positions. He kept detailed records. And slowly, an immense geographic puzzle began coming together. The more he traveled, the more he realized how much remained unknown. Beyond the Great Lakes stretched enormous territories connected by waterways that few Europeans fully understood. For the fur trade, these regions represented opportunity. For Thompson, they represented questions waiting to be answered. As competition intensified, both major fur trading companies pushed farther west. The search for new sources of fur encouraged exploration across vast areas. Trading posts appeared in increasingly remote locations. Voyagers carried goods through regions where European influence remained limited. Every year, more information returned from the interior. Yet information alone was not enough. Someone needed to organize it. Someone needed to transform countless observations into coherent maps. That task became Thompson's specialty. He traveled relentlessly. Thousands of miles became tens of thousands. The forests, rivers, plains, and mountain valleys of North America became his workplace. Many explorers are remembered for a single dramatic expedition. Thompson's achievement was different. His accomplishment came from persistence. Journey after journey. Observation after observation. Year after year. The result was one of the most remarkable mapping projects in history. Meanwhile, the fur trade itself continued changing. The farther traders moved west, the more they encountered new environments. The dense forests of the east gradually gave way to open grasslands. River systems flowed in different directions. Climate conditions varied. The continent revealed its immense diversity. For many voyagers and traders, these landscapes seemed endless. Days could pass with little sign of human settlement. Weeks could pass without seeing another trading party. The scale of North America continued to surprise even experienced travelers. Yet wherever traders went, they relied upon indigenous knowledge. This remained one of the most important realities of the fur trade. European maps were improving. But indigenous peoples had known these lands for generations. Guides shared information about routes. Hunters described river systems. Communities provided local knowledge that often proved essential for survival. Without those contributions, many expeditions would have failed. Thompson understood this better than most. Throughout his career, he learned from indigenous travelers whose geographic knowledge frequently surpassed anything available in European records. The fur trade was therefore not simply revealing North America. It was combining different traditions of knowledge. Indigenous experience and European mapping techniques increasingly worked together. The result was a deeper understanding of the continent than either system could have produced alone. As the years passed, Thompson's reputation grew. Merchants valued his accuracy. Travelers trusted his observations. Company officials relied upon his reports. And the maps he created became increasingly important. Yet his greatest challenges still lay ahead. Because beyond the forests and plains stood one of the most formidable barriers in North America: the Rocky Mountains. For generations, those mountains had inspired both curiosity and uncertainty. What lay beyond them? Could trade routes cross them? Might they lead toward the Pacific Ocean? The fur trade wanted answers. And David Thompson intended to help find them. As the 19th century began, the competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company grew even more intense. Profits remained high. Demand for fur remained strong. And both companies understood that the future belonged to those willing to push farther into the unknown. The search for beaver pelts had already carried traders across forests, lakes, and plains. Soon it would carry them across mountains as well. And on the far side of those mountains, a new chapter of the fur trade was waiting to begin. In the early years of the 19th century, the Rocky Mountains stood as one of the greatest barriers in North America. To people living in Europe, they were still largely mysterious. Even many experienced fur traders knew them only through reports carried across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Some described towering peaks covered in snow. Others spoke of difficult passes and dangerous travel. Nearly everyone agreed on one point: crossing the mountains would not be easy. Yet the fur trade had never rewarded caution alone. It rewarded those willing to travel farther than their competitors. And so, year after year, traders continued pushing westward. Among them was David Thompson. By now, he had become one of the most respected figures in the fur trade. His maps were admired for their accuracy. His knowledge of the interior was unmatched. And his experience made him uniquely qualified to explore regions that remained poorly understood. For Thompson, the mountains represented more than a geographic challenge. They represented a gateway. Beyond them lay the vast drainage systems flowing toward the Pacific Ocean. If trade routes could be established there, commercial opportunities might expand dramatically. The Northwest Company understood this. The Hudson's Bay Company understood it as well. The struggle for the future of the fur trade was increasingly becoming a struggle for the West. In 1807, Thompson crossed the Rocky Mountains through a pass in what is now western Canada. The journey was demanding. Mountain travel always involved risks. Weather could change suddenly. Supplies were limited. Routes were uncertain. Yet Thompson continued forward. As he descended the western slopes, he entered landscapes that few Europeans had previously documented in detail. Great rivers flowed toward the Pacific. Dense forests covered valleys and mountainsides. The geography differed dramatically from the regions farther east. Every mile expanded knowledge. Every observation improved future maps. Thompson spent years exploring and surveying the Columbia River system. Today, the Columbia is recognized as one of the most important rivers in western North America. At the time, it represented both a transportation corridor and a commercial opportunity. For traders viewed rivers as infrastructure. A navigable river could connect distant regions. It could move goods more efficiently than overland travel. And in an era before railroads, such advantages mattered enormously. The Columbia system offered possibilities that merchants found difficult to ignore. As Thompson traveled through these western territories, he continued his careful work of observation and measurement. The results were extraordinary. By the end of his career, he had mapped nearly 4 million square kilometers of North America. His maps were among the most accurate produced anywhere in the world during that era. Many remained useful for decades. Some historians have argued that Thompson accomplished more geographic surveying than almost any individual of his time. Whether or not that claim is entirely accurate, there is little doubt about his importance. He helped transform vast areas of North America from uncertain spaces on maps into known landscapes. And he did so largely because the fur trade demanded information. The connection is worth emphasizing. The fur trade did not merely follow exploration. In many cases, it created exploration. Merchants needed routes. Companies needed geographic knowledge. Investors needed information. Explorers provided all three. As a result, commercial competition accelerated the process of discovery. Meanwhile, events within the fur trade itself were becoming increasingly dramatic. The rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had entered a new phase. For years, both organizations had competed for furs and trading partners. Now they were competing for territory, influence, and survival. The farther west they expanded, the more frequently their operations overlapped. Trading posts appeared near one another. Employees competed for customers. Prices fluctuated. Tensions increased. At times, the rivalry resembled a commercial contest. At other times, it resembled a Cold War conducted across the wilderness. Each company watched the other carefully. Each sought advantages. Each feared losing access to profitable regions. The competition created pressure throughout the system. Managers demanded results. Traders sought better opportunities. Expeditions pushed deeper into remote areas. What had once been a relatively stable business was becoming increasingly aggressive. This transformation affected many people. Indigenous communities found themselves courted by competing companies. Different traders offered different goods. Competition sometimes produced better prices. But it also introduced new tensions. The fur trade was becoming more crowded. More posts. More traders. More economic pressure. And beneath it all remained the same driving force that had shaped the industry for centuries. European demand. As long as consumers continued purchasing beaver hats, merchants would continue seeking beaver pelts. As long as profits remained available, companies would continue competing. The entire system depended upon a fashion trend that most participants would never personally witness. A hunter in the interior of North America might never see the finished hat produced from a beaver pelt. A customer in London might never imagine the journey that pelt had taken. Yet both were connected. The fur trade linked their worlds together. This relationship highlights one of the remarkable aspects of early globalization. People separated by oceans and continents influenced one another's lives without ever meeting. A decision made in a European marketplace could affect activity thousands of miles away. Changes in consumer demand could influence exploration, transportation, and commerce across North America. The fur trade was a global system long before the modern age of globalization. And by the early 19th century, that system was approaching a turning point. Because competition was becoming increasingly expensive. Both major companies were spending enormous resources to maintain their positions. The struggle could not continue forever. Eventually something would have to change. Yet before that change arrived, another important development was unfolding across the northern plains. A new people were emerging as a powerful force within the fur trade world. They spoke multiple languages. They moved comfortably between cultures. They played essential roles in transportation, trade, and diplomacy. And their story would become one of the most important chapters in the history of the continent. They were the Métis. And the future of the fur trade would be deeply connected to their rise. Long before governments recognized them as a distinct people, the Métis were already helping shape the fur trade. Their story emerged naturally from the world that the trade had created. For generations, European traders had formed relationships with indigenous women across North America. Some of these relationships were temporary. Others became lasting family connections that stretched across decades. Children born into these families often grew up with knowledge of multiple cultures, multiple languages, and multiple ways of understanding the world. Over time, particularly in the regions surrounding the Great Lakes and the Northern Plains, many of these families developed a distinct identity. They became neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous. Instead, they formed communities with traditions and experiences uniquely their own. The rise of the Métis demonstrates an important truth about the fur trade. The trade was never simply an exchange of goods. It was also an exchange of people, knowledge, customs, and relationships. Economic systems often create social change. The fur trade created entire societies. By the early 19th century, Métis communities had become an essential part of the commercial network stretching across western North America. Many Métis men worked as voyageurs, guides, interpreters, hunters, and traders. Many possessed remarkable skills. They understood the geography of the interior. They knew transportation routes. They spoke languages that allowed communication across cultural boundaries. And they often maintained family connections extending throughout the fur trade world. These advantages made them invaluable. A company seeking success in the interior frequently depended upon Métis labor and expertise. Their contributions reached far beyond transportation. They helped move information. They helped negotiate relationships. They helped maintain the flow of commerce across enormous distances. Without their participation, the fur trade would have looked very different. One of the most important centers of Métis life developed near the Red River. The Red River flows through what is now southern Manitoba and portions of the northern United States. In the early 19th century, this region occupied a strategic position between different trading networks. River systems connected it to the interior. Transportation routes linked it to distant markets. The location made it ideal for communities involved in commerce and travel. Life on the northern plains differed significantly from life in the forests farther east. Open grasslands stretched toward distant horizons. Large herds of bison moved across the landscape. The environment created opportunities that would become central to Métis society. Among the most important was the bison hunt. To modern audiences, the word bison may sound only loosely connected to the fur trade. In reality, bison played a crucial role in the economy of western North America. Their meat provided food. Their hides supplied valuable materials. And one particular product became enormously important: pemmican. Pemmican was a highly nutritious food made primarily from dried meat mixed with fat. Sometimes berries were added as well. The result was remarkably practical. It could be stored for long periods. It provided substantial energy. It traveled well. And perhaps most importantly, it was ideal for people constantly moving through the wilderness. The fur trade consumed enormous quantities of pemmican. Voyageurs needed food. Trading posts needed supplies. Expeditions needed provisions. As commercial networks expanded westward, demand for pemmican increased dramatically. Métis hunters became major suppliers. Large organized bison hunts developed on the plains. These hunts required planning, cooperation, and skill. Participants often traveled together in substantial groups. Leaders organized movement. Rules governed behavior. Responsibilities were assigned. The hunts could resemble highly coordinated operations. Success provided food not only for local communities but for distant trading networks as well. In this way, the plains economy became deeply connected to the fur trade. A voyageur paddling through a river hundreds of miles away might be eating food produced by a Métis hunting expedition he would never see. The connections linking North America together continued growing more complex. As Métis' influence expanded, so did their importance within the rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. Both companies required transportation. Both required provisions. Both needed experienced workers. The Métis supplied all three. Their labor helped keep the commercial system functioning. Yet this growing importance also placed them at the center of future conflicts. Because the struggle between the two great fur trading companies was becoming increasingly intense. Competition had already spread across forests, rivers, and trading posts. Soon it would reach the plains as well. And when commerce, territory, and survival become intertwined, disputes rarely remain peaceful for long. The foundations of a major conflict were beginning to form. At first, the signs seemed small. A disagreement over supplies. A dispute about trade. A struggle for influence in strategic regions. But beneath those immediate issues lay larger questions. Who would control the future of the fur trade? Which company would dominate the interior? And who would decide how the resources of the West were used? The answers were still uncertain. Yet the Red River region was rapidly becoming one of the most important places in North America. A crossroads of commerce. A meeting point of cultures. A center of transportation. And eventually, a battleground in one of the fur trade's most dramatic rivalries. For decades, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had competed for profits. Now the competition was becoming personal. Employees confronted one another. Communities felt the pressure. Tensions rose across the interior. The fur trade had helped build a vast commercial empire. But that empire was beginning to show signs of strain. And in the years ahead, the conflict surrounding the Red River would push the entire system toward a moment of crisis. By the early 19th century, the rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had become one of the most intense business competitions in North American history. Both organizations controlled vast networks. Both employed thousands of people. Both depended upon the same resources. And both wanted dominance. At first, competition had encouraged growth. New trading posts appeared. New routes were discovered. Exploration accelerated. Profits increased. But competition has limits. When two powerful organizations pursue the same opportunities for too long, the struggle can become destructive. By 1810, signs of that transformation were becoming increasingly visible. The fur trade was expensive. Trading posts required supplies. Employees required wages. Transportation required constant investment. Expanding farther into the interior demanded additional resources. Both companies were spending heavily. At the same time, many of the most accessible beaver populations had already been hunted for generations. Beavers remained abundant in many regions, but traders often needed to travel farther than before. The costs of doing business continued rising. Yet neither company wanted to retreat. Retreat meant surrendering territory. Retreat meant losing influence. Retreat meant giving opportunities to a rival. So the competition intensified. The Red River region became one of the focal points of this struggle. To understand why, it helps to remember the geography. The Red River occupied a strategic location connecting different transportation systems. It served as a gateway between the northern forests and the western plains. Trade routes converged there. Supplies moved through there. People traveled through there. Control of the region offered significant advantages. In 1811, another development complicated matters further. Thomas Douglas, better known as Lord Selkirk, received a large land grant from the Hudson's Bay Company. Selkirk was a Scottish nobleman with interests that extended beyond commerce. He believed agricultural settlements could provide opportunities for displaced Scottish families while also strengthening British influence in North America. His plan led to the establishment of the Red River Colony. From Selkirk's perspective, the idea seemed reasonable. Settlers would farm the land. Communities would grow. The colony would provide stability in a remote region. Yet the proposal created immediate concerns for many people already living and working in the area. The Northwest Company viewed the colony with suspicion. Its leaders worried that agricultural settlement might interfere with transportation routes and commercial operations. Métis communities also had concerns. The region was already part of their economic world. The arrival of settlers introduced new uncertainties. Questions about land use, resources, and authority became increasingly important. What followed was a complicated and often tense period. Economic competition mixed with political disagreements. Different groups pursued different objectives. Misunderstandings multiplied. Trust became difficult to maintain. One issue proved particularly controversial: food. At first glance, food may seem like a surprisingly small matter. In reality, it was central to the functioning of the fur trade. Trading posts depended upon reliable supplies. Voyagers depended upon provisions. Expeditions depended upon stored food. Without adequate supplies, commerce could not function effectively. Pemmican remained especially important. Its durability and nutritional value made it ideal for long-distance transportation. Large quantities moved through fur trade networks every year. Recognizing its importance, officials associated with the Red River Colony attempted to restrict certain pemmican exports in order to ensure adequate supplies for local settlers. The decision became known as the Pemmican Proclamation of 1814. From the perspective of colony officials, the policy appeared practical. They wanted food security. From the perspective of many Métis hunters and Northwest Company interests, the policy appeared threatening. Pemmican was not merely food. It was a major economic resource. Restrictions affected livelihoods. Restrictions affected trade. Restrictions affected power. The controversy intensified existing tensions. Arguments became confrontations. Confrontations became larger disputes. The rivalry that had once centered primarily on commerce increasingly resembled a political struggle. Throughout the region, loyalties divided communities. People found themselves caught between competing interests. The Hudson's Bay Company supported the colony. The Northwest Company opposed many of its policies. Métis communities sought to protect their own economic interests and autonomy. The situation grew increasingly unstable. By 1815 and 1816, tensions had reached dangerous levels. The Red River region stood at the center of a conflict involving commerce, settlement, identity, and power. No single group controlled the situation completely. Events developed through a combination of decisions, misunderstandings, ambitions, and fears. Like many historical conflicts, the crisis emerged gradually before suddenly becoming dramatic. The most famous moment arrived in June 1816, near a place called Seven Oaks. There, a confrontation occurred that would become one of the defining events in the history of the fur trade. The encounter lasted only a short time, yet its consequences echoed for years. The Battle of Seven Oaks, as it later became known, involved forces associated with the Red River Colony and a larger Métis group led by Cuthbert Grant. The details remain the subject of historical discussion. Different participants interpreted events differently. What is clear is that violence erupted. When the confrontation ended, numerous men lay dead. The outcome shocked many observers. The conflict demonstrated how far tensions had escalated. What had begun as commercial rivalry now involved bloodshed. News traveled quickly. Company officials reacted with alarm. Political leaders paid attention. The situation could no longer be dismissed as a simple business dispute. The struggle threatened the stability of the entire fur trade system. For years, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had competed aggressively. Now many people began asking whether such competition had become unsustainable. The costs were rising. The tensions were rising. The risks were rising. Something would eventually have to give. In the aftermath of Seven Oaks, either side emerged with a decisive victory. The rivalry continued. Accusations continued. Economic pressure continued. But a growing number of influential people were reaching the same conclusion. The fur trade could not continue operating indefinitely under conditions that resembled open warfare. A dramatic solution was approaching. And when it arrived, it would permanently reshape the history of North America. The years following the Battle of Seven Oaks were filled with uncertainty. The violence had demonstrated how dangerous the rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had become. What had started as commercial competition now threatened political stability across large portions of North America. Both companies continued operating. Both still possessed vast trading networks. But maintaining those networks was becoming increasingly expensive. For decades, the two organizations had built duplicate systems across the continent. Where one company established a trading post, the other often built a rival post nearby. Where one company sent traders, the other dispatched its own employees. The competition sometimes benefited customers. Yet from a business perspective, it often wasted resources. Two companies were paying to maintain infrastructure where one might have been sufficient. Profits that could have been invested elsewhere disappeared into the costs of rivalry. The situation became even more complicated because both companies depended upon many of the same people. They recruited from similar communities. They hired experienced voyagers. They worked with the same transportation networks. And they sought access to the same fur-producing regions. Every year, the struggle consumed more money. Investors noticed. Government officials noticed. Company leaders noticed. The question was becoming impossible to ignore. Could the fur trade continue under such conditions? By the early 1820s, many influential figures believed the answer was no. A major change was necessary. That change arrived in 1821. In that year, after years of rivalry, negotiation, and pressure from British authorities, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged. The merger ranks among the most important events in the history of the fur trade. For generations, the two companies had shaped exploration, commerce, and settlement across northern North America. Now they became a single organization. The decision transformed the economic landscape of the continent. To understand why, it helps to consider the scale of the operation. The merged company controlled an enormous territory. Its trading posts stretched across forests, plains, river systems, and northern wilderness. Its employees numbered in the thousands. Its influence reached from the Atlantic world deep into the interior. Few businesses anywhere in the world possessed such geographic reach. The merger also brought practical advantages. Duplicate posts could be closed. Transportation could be reorganized. Resources could be concentrated more efficiently. The endless struggle that had consumed so much energy could finally end. At least in theory. In reality, major mergers rarely solve every problem immediately. people who had spent years competing with one another suddenly found themselves working for the same organization. Different corporate cultures needed to be integrated. Management structures required adjustment. Old rivalries did not disappear overnight. Even so, the merger marked a turning point. For the first time in decades, a single company dominated much of the northern fur trade. The Hudson's Bay Company entered a new phase of its history. Its leaders focused on efficiency. They sought to maximize profits while reducing unnecessary costs. This strategy reflected changing economic realities. The era of rapid expansion was beginning to slow. The continent was no longer as geographically mysterious as it had once been. Major transportation routes were known. Many important trading regions had already been incorporated into commercial networks. The future depended less upon discovering entirely new territories and more upon managing existing ones effectively. The company reorganized its operations accordingly. Some posts expanded. Others closed. Supply systems were adjusted. Administrative structures evolved. The goal was simple: create a more efficient enterprise. At the same time, the merger revealed how much North America had changed during the previous century and a half. When the Hudson's Bay Company had been founded in 1670, Europeans possessed only limited knowledge of the continent's interior. By 1821, that situation was dramatically different. Thousands of miles of routes connected distant regions. Maps had improved enormously. Trading networks extended across vast territories. Much of that transformation had occurred because of the fur trade. The search for beaver pelts had helped reveal the geography of a continent. Yet, while the company consolidated its position in the north, important developments were unfolding farther south. The United States had emerged as an independent nation. Its population was growing rapidly. Settlement continued pushing westward, and American entrepreneurs were beginning to recognize the opportunities presented by the fur trade. For decades, British and Canadian networks had dominated much of the industry. That dominance would soon face a new challenge. A challenge led by one of the most ambitious businessmen in American history. His name was John Jacob Astor, and his influence on the fur trade would be enormous. Astor's story began far from the forests and rivers of North America. Born in Germany in 1763, he immigrated to the United States as a young man. Like many immigrants, he arrived seeking opportunity. Unlike most immigrants, he would eventually become one of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Astor possessed a talent that many successful entrepreneurs share. He understood how economic systems worked. More importantly, he understood where opportunities existed. The fur trade presented one of those opportunities. Demand remained strong. Markets remained profitable. And the expanding United States offered new possibilities for growth. Astor entered the trade gradually. He purchased furs. He developed commercial relationships. He expanded his operations. Over time, his involvement increased. By the early 19th century, he had become one of the most significant figures in the American fur business. His ambitions, however, extended far beyond ordinary trade. Astor envisioned a commercial empire stretching across the continent. He wanted access to Western resources. He wanted connections to Pacific markets. He wanted a position strong enough to compete with the established fur trading powers of the North. To pursue those goals, he created the American Fur Company in 1808. The company would eventually become one of the most influential businesses in the history of the United States. Its rise signaled an important shift. For generations, the fur trade had been dominated largely by British and Canadian organizations. Now American interests were becoming increasingly important. The balance of power was beginning to change. And as the United States expanded westward, the American Fur Company intended to expand with it. A new chapter in the history of the fur trade was opening. The age of fierce competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company was ending. The age of American expansion was beginning. And across the rivers, plains, and mountain valleys of the continent, traders were preparing for a future that would look very different from the past. When most people think about the expansion of the United States, they often imagine wagon trains moving westward across the plains. They imagine pioneers building farms. They imagine gold seekers searching mountain streams. They imagine railroads eventually connecting distant regions. Yet before many of those developments reached their peak, another force was already helping pull Americans toward the west: the fur trade. By the early 19th century, the United States was growing rapidly. Population increased. Settlements expanded. New states entered the Union. Political leaders and entrepreneurs looked toward the vast territories beyond the Mississippi River and saw opportunity. The fur trade became one of the earliest economic systems linking Americans to those distant lands. At the center of that effort stood John Jacob Astor and the American Fur Company. Astor understood something important. The future of the industry depended upon geography. The farther west traders could operate, the greater their access to valuable resources. And if those western regions could somehow be connected to Pacific trade routes, the potential rewards might be enormous. These ideas encouraged some of the most ambitious commercial ventures of the era. One of Astor's boldest plans involved establishing a trading post near the mouth of the Columbia River on the Pacific coast. The location appeared promising. The Columbia connected vast inland territories to the ocean. Ships could potentially transport goods across the Pacific. Trade networks might extend not only across North America but into Asia as well. In theory, the possibilities were extraordinary. To support this vision, Astor backed an expedition that eventually established a settlement called Astoria in 1811. Located near the mouth of the Columbia River, Astoria became the first permanent American settlement on the Pacific coast. Its creation represented more than a commercial project. It symbolized American ambitions in the West. Yet the timing proved difficult. The War of 1812 erupted between the United States and Britain. The conflict disrupted trade. Supply lines became uncertain. Commercial plans encountered unexpected obstacles. Although Astoria survived for a time, Astor's original vision never developed exactly as he had hoped. Even so, the effort remained historically significant. The settlement demonstrated that American commercial interests had reached the Pacific, and it helped establish precedents that would influence future expansion. Meanwhile, farther inland, the fur trade was undergoing another transformation. The center of activity was gradually shifting. For generations, beaver pelts had moved through extensive networks of indigenous hunters, voyagers, and trading posts. Those systems remained important. But new regions were attracting attention. The Rocky Mountains. The mountain valleys and river systems of the American West contained substantial beaver populations. For traders seeking profit, they represented opportunity. And opportunity attracts ambitious people. This period gave rise to one of the most famous groups in Western American history: the Mountain Men. Today, mountain men often occupy a legendary place in popular culture. They are remembered as rugged figures living in remote wilderness areas. Many stories portray them as solitary adventurers surviving through courage and determination. Like many historical legends, there is some truth in these images. But the reality was more complex. Mountain men were deeply connected to the fur trade economy. They were not simply wandering through the wilderness. They were workers within a commercial system. Their task was straightforward: find beavers, trap them, prepare the pelts, deliver them to trading networks. The work demanded extraordinary endurance. Trappers spent months away from settlements. They traveled through difficult terrain. They faced harsh weather. They encountered unfamiliar environments. And they accepted significant risks. The rewards, however, could be substantial. Successful trappers sometimes earned far more than many ordinary laborers of the period. The possibility of profit encouraged people to venture into regions that few Americans had previously visited. Among the most famous mountain men was Jedediah Smith. Born in New York in 1799, Smith became one of the great explorers of the American West. Like many figures associated with the fur trade, he combined commercial ambition with geographic curiosity. His journeys carried him across vast areas of the continent. He crossed deserts. He crossed mountains. He traveled through regions largely unknown to most Americans. And everywhere he went, he gathered information. Smith's expeditions helped expand American understanding of Western geography. He identified routes. He documented landscapes. He demonstrated possibilities for future travel. In this respect, he resembled earlier fur trade explorers such as Alexander Mackenzie and David Thompson. The pattern repeated itself. The search for economic opportunity produced geographic knowledge. Commerce encouraged exploration. Exploration encouraged further commerce. The cycle continued. Another famous mountain man was Jim Bridger. Bridger entered the fur trade as a teenager and eventually became one of the most knowledgeable frontiersmen in North America. His experience covered enormous territories. He knew rivers, mountain passes, and plains routes. His reputation for geographic expertise became legendary. Like many mountain men, Bridger's knowledge later proved valuable to settlers, travelers, and government expeditions moving westward. This connection is important. The fur trade often served as the first stage of expansion. Traders entered regions before large-scale settlement. They learned routes. They identified resources. They accumulated geographic information. Later generations frequently used that knowledge for entirely different purposes. The fur trade therefore acted as a bridge between exploration and settlement. Many of the pathways later used by emigrants, soldiers, and settlers had first been traveled by indigenous peoples and fur traders. The history of Western expansion did not begin with wagon trains. In many places, it began with canoes, horses, and beaver traps. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, the Rocky Mountain fur trade reached its peak. Trappers spread across mountain valleys and river systems. Trading networks expanded. Profits flowed through the industry. The era produced countless stories of adventure and survival. Yet beneath the excitement, deeper economic forces were already beginning to reshape the business. No industry remains unchanged forever. Markets evolve. Consumer preferences shift. Resources become harder to obtain. The fur trade would eventually experience all of these challenges. But for the moment, the mountain men represented the leading edge of a commercial frontier that continued pushing westward. And nowhere was that frontier more visible than at the great gatherings known as the Rendezvous. Each year, traders, trappers, merchants, and indigenous participants traveled long distances to meet at temporary trading centers in the Rocky Mountains. There they exchanged goods, shared news, settled accounts, and prepared for another season in the wilderness. The Rendezvous became legendary. They represented the high point of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. And they marked the beginning of one of the most fascinating chapters in the story of how the fur trade helped shape North America. Imagine spending an entire year in the wilderness. Months away from towns. Months away from regular supplies. Months surrounded by mountains, rivers, forests, and open plains. For many fur trappers of the early 19th century, this was not unusual. It was simply life. Each season began with uncertainty. Success depended upon weather, skill, luck, and the availability of beavers. Some years produced substantial profits. Other years produced disappointment. No trapper could predict exactly what the season would bring. Yet despite the hardships, thousands of men continued entering the fur trade. The rewards seemed worth the risks. One of the most distinctive features of the Rocky Mountain fur trade was the rendezvous system. Developed largely by entrepreneurs such as William Henry Ashley, the system transformed how commerce operated in the West. Before the rendezvous system became common, many trappers had to transport their furs long distances to trading posts. The process consumed time and effort. Ashley recognized a simpler approach. Instead of forcing trappers to travel to established centers, merchants could bring supplies directly into the mountains. The idea proved remarkably effective. Each summer, temporary trading gatherings appeared in carefully chosen locations. Trappers arrived carrying the furs they had collected during the previous season. Merchants arrived with supplies. The exchange benefited everyone involved. Furs moved eastward. Goods moved westward. Business continued. The rendezvous system also reduced some of the isolation experienced by trappers. For much of the year, many worked in small groups scattered across enormous territories. At rendezvous gatherings, they could meet friends, exchange information, and hear news from distant regions. Stories circulated. Rumors spread. Business deals were arranged. For a brief period, remote mountain valleys became centers of economic activity. The gatherings acquired an almost legendary reputation. Later writers often emphasized the excitement and celebration associated with them. Some descriptions may have been exaggerated over time. Yet there is little doubt that rendezvous events became important social occasions within the fur trade world. They brought together people from many different backgrounds. American trappers, French-Canadian voyagers, Métis participants, indigenous traders, merchants, interpreters, guides. The fur trade remained one of the most culturally diverse enterprises in North America. This diversity reflected the geography of the trade itself. The industry connected regions separated by thousands of miles. It linked forests to plains, plains to mountains, mountains to oceans. People moving through those networks inevitably carried ideas, languages, and traditions with them. As a result, the fur trade created connections extending far beyond economics. Meanwhile, the western frontier continued attracting ambitious individuals. Some arrived seeking wealth. Others sought adventure. Many sought both. The Rocky Mountains occupied a special place in the imagination of the era. To people living in eastern cities, they represented distance, mystery, and opportunity. Newspaper reports occasionally described the activities of trappers and explorers. Travel narratives circulated among readers curious about the West. The region began acquiring an almost mythical reputation. Yet for those actually living there, daily life often involved practical concerns. Finding food, repairing equipment, caring for animals, preparing for winter. The realities of frontier existence rarely resembled the romantic stories later generations would tell. Still, the work mattered. Every expedition added information. Every route contributed to geographic knowledge. Every successful season strengthened commercial connections. The fur trade continued serving as one of the primary mechanisms through which Americans learned about the West. In many respects, mountain men became unofficial explorers. Although profit remained their primary objective, their travels generated knowledge with lasting significance. They identified river crossings. They located mountain passes. They documented water sources. They described landscapes. Years later, emigrants traveling west would benefit from information first gathered by fur traders. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout North American history. Economic activity often preceded settlement. People searching for resources entered new regions. Their experiences created knowledge. That knowledge encouraged additional movement. The process repeated itself. The fur trade played this role across enormous portions of the continent. Yet while mountain men occupied an increasingly prominent place in the American West, another important development was occurring farther north. The Hudson's Bay Company had emerged from the merger of 1821 stronger than ever. With its major rival gone, the company controlled a vast commercial empire. Its leaders focused on efficiency and long-term profitability. One of the most influential figures in this new era was George Simpson. Simpson joined the Hudson's Bay Company during a period of transformation and eventually became governor of its North American operations. He quickly developed a reputation for energy, discipline, and administrative skill. Under his leadership, the company sought to streamline operations across its enormous territory. Traveling thousands of miles to inspect posts and evaluate performance, Simpson acquired an unusually detailed understanding of the organization he managed. His influence extended throughout the fur trade world. Company employees often regarded him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. He demanded results. He expected efficiency. And he believed strongly in reducing unnecessary expenses. These priorities reflected broader changes occurring within the industry. The age of exploration had produced valuable geographic knowledge. Now businesses increasingly focused on management. Profitability mattered more than ever. Companies needed to balance expansion with sustainability. Resources could not be exploited indefinitely without consequences. In some regions, beaver populations had already declined significantly. The effects varied from place to place. Some areas remained productive. Others became less profitable. The industry faced growing challenges. Few participants fully recognized it yet, but the fur trade was approaching a period of transition. The forces that had created centuries of prosperity were beginning to change. Markets would soon evolve. Consumer tastes would shift. And the economic foundations of the industry would gradually weaken. For the moment, however, many participants remained optimistic. The rendezvous system was thriving. The Rocky Mountain trade remained active. The Hudson's Bay Company continued generating profits. The future still appeared promising. Yet history often changes quietly before it changes dramatically. The warning signs were already present. Most people simply had not noticed them. Far away in the cities of Europe, fashion trends were beginning to evolve. New materials were becoming popular. New styles were emerging. And those seemingly small changes would eventually affect hunters, traders, voyagers, and companies across an entire continent. The fur trade had helped build North America. Soon it would discover that even the largest commercial empires remained vulnerable to the changing preferences of distant customers. For nearly 2 centuries, beaver fur had occupied a central place in the economy of North America. Generations of traders had crossed rivers, lakes, forests, and mountains in pursuit of it. Companies had built trading empires around it. Governments had claimed territories because of it. Explorers had mapped continents while searching for it. Entire communities had emerged within the commercial networks it created. The fur trade seemed permanent. Yet no market remains unchanged forever. One of the most important lessons in economic history is that consumer preferences can reshape entire industries. Sometimes the change happens gradually. Sometimes it happens with surprising speed. Either way, businesses that depend upon a single product often face significant risks. The fur trade would eventually learn this lesson. To understand why, it helps to return briefly to Europe. For generations, beaver felt hats had been symbols of style and status. demand remained strong because consumers continued purchasing them. As long as fashionable people wanted beaver hats, merchants wanted beaver pelts. The connection appeared stable. But fashion is rarely stable for long. Styles change. Materials change. Tastes change. By the early 19th century, new trends were beginning to emerge. Silk hats gained popularity among many consumers. Advances in manufacturing made silk products increasingly practical and desirable. As demand for silk hats increased, demand for traditional beaver hats gradually weakened. At first, the change seemed modest. Markets fluctuate all the time. Merchants often assume temporary declines will reverse themselves. Sometimes they do. This time, however, a larger transformation was underway. The shift did not eliminate demand for fur immediately. Many people continued purchasing fur products. Fur remained valuable. But the extraordinary demand that had sustained centuries of expansion was beginning to fade. The effects appeared slowly. Prices fluctuated. Profits became less predictable. Certain regions generated lower returns. Companies adjusted strategies. At the same time, another challenge was emerging. In many areas, intensive trapping had reduced beaver populations. The situation varied considerably across North America. Some regions remained productive. Others had experienced decades of heavy harvesting. Trappers often needed to travel farther to obtain the same results. The economics of the trade became more complicated. Higher transportation costs combined with changing market conditions. The result was increasing pressure on profitability. These developments highlight an important economic principle. Resources alone do not create wealth. Resources must also be valuable to consumers. A warehouse filled with goods becomes less useful if fewer people wish to buy them. The fur trade depended upon demand. When demand changed, the industry changed. By the 1830s and 1840s, many participants recognized that the business was entering a different era. The great age of expansion was fading. The future would not look exactly like the past. Yet, while the beaver trade weakened, the influence of the fur trade continued shaping North America in other ways. This is one reason historians find the industry so fascinating. Its legacy extended far beyond economics. The fur trade had helped determine routes across the continent. It had encouraged exploration. It had influenced diplomacy. It had contributed to the growth of communities and settlements. Even as profits declined, those historical effects remained. Consider transportation routes. Many paths first used by indigenous travelers later became fur trade corridors. Some eventually evolved into roads. Others influenced railway routes. Still others helped guide patterns of settlement. The movement of people across North America rarely occurred randomly. Travelers followed practical routes whenever possible. The fur trade identified many of those routes long before large populations arrived. The same pattern appeared in geography. Maps created by explorers such as David Thompson remained valuable. Knowledge gathered during generations of commercial activity continued benefiting governments, settlers, and future travelers. The industry's contributions survived even as the industry itself changed. The fur trade also played an important role in defining political boundaries. Modern maps often create the impression that borders emerged naturally. In reality, borders usually develop through long historical processes. Commerce frequently influences those processes. The Hudson's Bay Company's presence strengthened British influence across large portions of northern North America. American fur traders contributed to expanding United States interests in the West. Indigenous nations negotiated, adapted, resisted, and participated throughout these developments. The result was a complex political landscape whose effects remain visible today. In many respects, The modern border between Canada and the United States emerged within territories profoundly shaped by the fur trade. The industry helped determine where people traveled, where settlements appeared, and where governments focused their attention. These influences accumulated over time. No single transaction created a nation. No single expedition defined a border. But thousands of decisions made by traders, hunters, explorers, and communities collectively influenced the continent's future. The fur trade also left cultural legacies. Métis communities continued developing their distinct identity. Indigenous nations adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining traditions and pursuing their own goals. European and indigenous influences interacted in countless ways. Languages mixed. Customs evolved. Family networks expanded. The history of North America became increasingly interconnected. This cultural dimension reminds us that commerce involves people, not just products. The fur trade was ultimately a human story. A story of cooperation and conflict. A story of ambition and adaptation. A story of movement across extraordinary distances. And a story of communities learning to navigate a rapidly changing world. As the 19th century progressed, new industries began assuming greater importance. Agriculture expanded. Railroads advanced. Mining attracted investment. Manufacturing grew. The economic center of gravity shifted. The fur trade no longer occupied the position it once held. Yet its influence remained embedded within the continent. The West that settlers entered had already been explored by generations of indigenous travelers and fur traders. The routes they followed had histories. The rivers they crossed had histories. The settlements they encountered had histories. The fur trade formed part of that larger story. And perhaps nowhere was this more apparent than in the Pacific Northwest. For decades, traders had moved through the Columbia River system and surrounding territories. They mapped routes. They established posts. They created commercial connections. Long before major waves of settlement arrived, the fur trade had already linked the region to wider economic networks. By the middle of the 19th century, however, another era was clearly beginning. Wagon trains appeared in greater numbers. Agricultural communities expanded. Governments increased their presence. The frontier was changing. The age of the fur trader was slowly giving way to the age of the settler. The transformation did not happen overnight. For years, elements of the Old World and the New World existed side by side. But the direction of change was becoming increasingly clear. The industry that had once driven exploration across a continent was no longer shaping the future as it once had. Its greatest achievements were now part of history. And those achievements had helped build North America itself. By the middle of the 19th century, a traveler crossing North America would have encountered a continent very different from the one Samuel de Champlain had known more than 2 centuries earlier. When the first European traders entered the interior, much of the continent existed beyond the reach of European governments. Maps contained vast blank spaces. Knowledge moved slowly. Transportation depended almost entirely upon rivers, lakes, and human endurance. The fur trade helped change all of that. Its influence was so widespread that many people living through these transformations scarcely noticed how much of their world had been shaped by the trade. Roads followed old trading corridors. Settlements appeared near former trading locations. Political claims often reflected areas first connected through commerce. The fur trade's fingerprints could be found almost everywhere. Yet history rarely moves in a straight line. The same economic forces that created an industry can eventually weaken it. As new opportunities emerged, investment flowed elsewhere. Railroads promised faster transportation. Agriculture supported growing populations. Industrialization created entirely new markets. Compared with these developments, trapping beavers seemed less central to the future. The world was changing. North America was changing. And the fur trade was gradually becoming part of the continent's past rather than its future. Still, even as the industry declined, some of its institutions survived. The most famous example was the Hudson's Bay Company. Unlike many businesses from earlier centuries, the company adapted. Its leaders recognized that relying solely on the fur trade would eventually become risky. Markets shifted. Consumer preferences changed. Competition evolved. A successful organization needed flexibility. Over time, the company diversified its activities. Trading posts that had once focused primarily on fur increasingly supplied goods to settlers and local communities. Commercial priorities changed. The business evolved alongside the continent. This adaptability helps explain why the Hudson's Bay Company survived long after many of its competitors disappeared. The company, founded in 1670, continued operating into modern times. Few corporations anywhere in the world can claim such longevity. Its survival serves as a reminder that institutions capable of adapting often outlast those that remain tied to a single economic model. Yet while the company endured, the world that created it gradually faded. The age of the voyageur was ending. For generations, voyageurs had served as the transportation network of the fur trade. They paddled thousands of miles. They carried heavy cargoes across portages. They connected distant communities through determination and skill. Their labor helped make the entire system possible. Today, they remain among the most iconic figures in Canadian history. Yet by the mid-19th century, technological change was altering transportation. Steamboats appeared on rivers. Railways expanded. New infrastructure reduced dependence on traditional travel methods. The old routines no longer dominated as they once had. The same pattern affected many other participants in the trade. Mountain men became less central to Western commerce. Large trapping expeditions declined. Some trading posts closed. Others transformed into settlements. The frontier economy evolved into something new. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the fur trade's legacy is how much of North America it helped reveal. When Europeans first arrived, they possessed limited understanding of the continent's interior. By the time the fur trade reached its peak, traders and explorers had mapped enormous territories. They identified rivers. They crossed mountain ranges. They established routes connecting distant regions. The geographic knowledge they gathered influenced generations that followed. This achievement becomes even more impressive when one considers the tools available at the time. There were no satellites, no airplanes, no modern navigation systems. Travelers relied upon observation, experience, and information shared by others. Much of that information came from indigenous communities whose knowledge of the land stretched back countless generations. The fur trade therefore represents a story of combined knowledge. European mapping techniques contributed one part. Indigenous geographic understanding contributed another. Together, they produced a more complete picture of North America. The importance of this partnership cannot be overstated. Without indigenous expertise, many routes would never have been discovered by European newcomers. Many expeditions would have failed. Many maps would have remained incomplete. The fur trade was not a story of one group acting alone. It was a story of interaction. Sometimes cooperative. Sometimes competitive. Often complicated. But always interconnected. That interconnectedness extended to economics as well. The fur trade linked remote regions of North America to markets across the Atlantic Ocean and beyond. A beaver trap near the Rocky Mountains could eventually influence commercial activity in London, Paris, or New York. The distances involved were extraordinary. Yet the system functioned. In doing so, It helped create one of the earliest large-scale economic networks spanning the continent. Modern globalization often seems like a recent phenomenon. In reality, earlier forms of global connection existed centuries ago. The fur trade was one of them. It connected producers, merchants, transport workers, investors, manufacturers, and consumers across enormous distances. Information traveled alongside goods. Money traveled alongside information. Economic decisions made in one region affected people living far away. The principles remain familiar even today. As historians look back on the fur trade, they often see more than an industry. They see a force that helped shape exploration, commerce, diplomacy, and settlement. They see a network that influenced the development of Canada. They see a system that contributed to the expansion of the United States. And they see a story that reveals how deeply economics can influence history. Because the fur trade did not build North America through a single event. It built North America through countless small decisions repeated across centuries. A hunter setting a trap. A voyageur loading a canoe. A merchant financing an expedition. A guide sharing knowledge of a river. A mapmaker recording a route. Each action seemed small on its own. Together, they transformed a continent. And yet, perhaps the most surprising part of the story is this. The people responsible for those transformations rarely knew how significant their actions would become. Most were simply trying to earn a living. They could not see the future. They could not know that the routes they followed, the communities they built, and the knowledge they shared would help shape nations. History often works that way. Great changes emerge from ordinary lives. And the story of the fur trade may be one of the clearest examples in all of North American history. As the 19th century moved forward and the great era of the fur trade slowly faded, memories of that world began transforming into history. The people who had spent their lives paddling rivers, crossing mountain passes, and trading across vast distances grew older. Some wrote memoirs. Some shared stories with younger generations. Many left behind only scattered records buried in company documents, journals, letters, and account books. Yet together, those records preserve a remarkable story. It is the story of how a simple desire for fur connected oceans, empires, nations, and peoples. At first glance, the fur trade seems almost too ordinary to have changed a continent. After all, beavers are small animals. Furs are simply materials. Trade is something that happens every day. Yet history often turns on ordinary things. Salt helped build empires. Spices reshaped global commerce. Tea influenced politics. And beaver pelts helped transform North America. One reason the fur trade had such a powerful impact was because it lasted so long. Many famous historical events occur over a few years. Some last only months. The fur trade influenced North America for centuries. Generations were born into it. Generations worked within it. Generations adapted their lives around it. Few economic systems maintained such influence for such a long period. Because of that longevity, its effects accumulated. A single trading post might seem unimportant. But hundreds of trading posts spread across centuries become a network. A single route might seem insignificant. But thousands of journeys transform routes into corridors of movement. A single alliance might appear temporary. But generations of relationships reshape societies. The fur trade succeeded not because of one dramatic moment, but because countless small actions reinforced one another over time. This gradual accumulation is one of the most important lessons of the story. When people think about nation building, they often focus on governments, wars, constitutions, and political leaders. Those factors matter. Yet economies matter too. People move toward opportunity. Communities form around trade. Transportation networks emerge where commerce exists. Political influence often follows economic activity. The fur trade demonstrates these patterns with remarkable clarity. In many regions, commerce arrived before government authority. Traders entered territories long before permanent settlements appeared. Economic relationships connected distant communities before political institutions did. The continent was being linked together through trade even before many modern borders existed. This process proved especially important in what would eventually become Canada. The vast northern territories of North America presented enormous geographic challenges. Distances were immense. Population remained relatively sparse. Transportation was difficult. The fur trade created connections across those distances. Rivers became commercial highways. Trading posts became centers of activity. Information moved through networks maintained by traders and voyagers. Some historians have argued that these connections helped create the foundations of a future nation. Whether one agrees completely with that interpretation or not, the influence of the trade is difficult to deny. The same is true in the United States. Long before railroads crossed the continent, fur traders were already moving through Western territories. They mapped routes. They identified resources. They gathered information. Their knowledge later helped settlers, soldiers, surveyors, and explorers. The American West did not suddenly appear on the national stage. It was gradually revealed through generations of movement and experience. The fur trade played a central role in that process. At the same time, the story reminds us that historical change rarely benefits everyone equally. The fur trade created opportunities. It generated wealth. It encouraged exploration. But it also brought disruption. Indigenous communities experienced profound changes as commercial relationships expanded. Traditional economies adapted. Political relationships shifted. New diseases affected populations. Competition sometimes produced conflict. No honest account of the fur trade can ignore these realities. History is rarely simple. Most major developments create both opportunities and challenges. The fur trade was no exception. Its legacy contains achievement and hardship, cooperation and conflict, prosperity and loss. Understanding that complexity allows us to appreciate the past more accurately. Perhaps this is one reason the story remains so compelling. It does not fit neatly into a single category. It is an economic story, a political story, a cultural story, an environmental story, and an exploration story, all at the same time. That complexity reflects the continent itself. North America has always been shaped by many different peoples pursuing many different goals. The fur trade brought those goals into contact with one another. Sometimes peacefully. Sometimes not. But always in ways that left lasting consequences. Even the environment still carries traces of this history. In some regions, intensive trapping significantly reduced beaver populations. Over time, many populations recovered. Yet the ecological effects of centuries of trapping remind us that economic activity can reshape landscapes. Humans influence the natural world. The fur trade provides an early example of that reality on a continental scale. Today, when travelers visit old trading post sites, they often find quiet places. A few reconstructed buildings. Historic markers. Museums. Rivers flowing past landscapes that seem almost timeless. It can be difficult to imagine the activity that once existed there. Canoes arriving with cargo. Voyagers unloading supplies. Merchants recording transactions. Interpreters translating conversations. Hunters exchanging furs. Yet for generations, such scenes formed part of everyday life across much of North America. The world they created has vanished. The influence they created has not. Every map tells part of the story. Every border tells part of the story. Every transportation corridor tells part of the story. And every community whose origins connect to the fur trade tells part of the story. The beaver trade may no longer dominate economies, but the continent it helped shape remains. And so, as our journey through the history of the fur trade comes to a close, we can look back across more than 3 centuries of change. From indigenous trading networks to European empires. From birchbark canoes to continental exploration. From isolated rivers to global markets. The fur trade connected them all. It began with a demand for fur. It ended by helping build North America. And that is why the story of the fur trade remains one of the most remarkable and influential chapters in the history of the continent. Before we leave this story behind, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider one final question. What would North America look like if the fur trade had never existed? It is an impossible question to answer with certainty. History does not provide alternate versions of the past for comparison. Yet the exercise helps reveal just how influential the fur trade truly was. Without the enormous demand for beaver pelts, European interest in the interior of North America would almost certainly have developed differently. Exploration would still have occurred. Settlement would still have expanded. But the pace, direction, and timing of those processes might have changed significantly. Many of the earliest long-distance transportation routes used by Europeans were created because traders needed access to furs. Many of the first sustained relationships between European newcomers and indigenous nations emerged through commerce. Many of the maps that guided future generations were produced because merchants needed geographic knowledge. The fur trade was not the only force shaping the continent, but it was one of the earliest and most influential. Its effects reached far beyond economics. Consider the vast river systems that became the highways of the trade. The St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, the Saskatchewan, the Columbia, the Mackenzie. For generations, these waterways connected distant regions long before railroads and highways existed. The fur trade transformed rivers into commercial corridors. Those corridors became pathways for exploration. Exploration encouraged settlement. Settlement encouraged political development. One step led naturally to another. History often advances through such chains of events. The same pattern can be seen in the lives of the people who participated in the trade. Very few of them expected to become historical figures. Samuel de Champlain wanted to strengthen New France. Radisson and de Groseilliers wanted support for their trading ideas. David Thompson wanted to map the land accurately. Alexander Mackenzie wanted to find routes through the wilderness. John Jacob Astor wanted to build a profitable business. Their goals were practical. Their ambitions were personal. Yet the consequences of their actions extended far beyond their own lives. The same was true for countless unnamed participants. The voyageur paddling against a strong current. The indigenous guide leading travelers through unfamiliar territory. The Métis hunter preparing pemmican for distant expeditions. The clerk recording transactions in a remote trading post. Most never imagined they were helping shape the future of a continent. Yet they were. History is often built by ordinary people whose names rarely appear in textbooks. The fur trade reminds us of that reality again and again. It is also a reminder that geography matters. The rivers, forests, plains, lakes, and mountains of North America were never simply background scenery. They shaped decisions. They created opportunities. They imposed limits. They influenced where people traveled and where communities formed. The fur trade succeeded because participants learned how to work within that geography. For centuries, canoes remained more practical than roads. Waterways remained more efficient than overland transport. Knowledge of the landscape became one of the most valuable resources in the entire economy. Those who understood the land possessed advantages that money alone could not buy. Perhaps that is why the story still feels so compelling today. It combines human ambition with natural landscapes on a truly enormous scale. It is a story of rivers stretching toward distant horizons, of forests that seemed endless, of journeys lasting months, of people crossing thousands of miles with little more than determination, experience, and hope. Modern life often moves quickly. Information arrives instantly. Maps appear with a touch of a screen. Travel that once required months can now be completed in hours. The fur trade belonged to a different world. A slower world. A world where distance mattered. A world where knowledge traveled person to person. A world where entire careers could be spent exploring a single region. Yet despite those differences, the people of that era faced questions that remain familiar. How do we adapt to change? How do we cooperate with people from different backgrounds? How do economies shape societies? How do small decisions influence larger events? The fur trade offers no simple answers, but it provides countless examples. And perhaps that is one reason its history continues to fascinate us centuries later. Because beneath the commerce, beneath the exploration, and beneath the political struggles, the story remains deeply human. A story of people seeking opportunity. A story of communities adapting to change. A story of cultures meeting, cooperating, competing, and evolving. And ultimately, a story of how a continent was transformed not by a single event, but by generations of movement, trade, and connection. As the rivers continue flowing and the old trading routes fade into memory, the legacy of that world remains all around us. In the borders of nations. In the locations of cities. In the maps we use. In the histories we inherit. And in the remarkable story of the fur trade that helped build North America.